Michael.
Hello, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Max Carfrey, and I'm environmental studies major at Dickinson. I also work for ALLARM, and I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our amazing director of ALLARM, Jules Vastine. Jules, a 2003 graduate at Dickinson College, has worked in the volunteer monitoring and community science field for 22 years. In 2019, they were appointed as the volunteer monitoring representative to the National Water Quality Monitoring Council, and they manage the National Volunteer Monitoring Work Group as well. They have also served 2 terms on the board of directors for the North American Association for the Advancement of Participatory Sciences. In 2023, they were participatory science subject matter expert in the Office of Research and Development at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. While there, Jules also did an Intergovernmental Personnel Act fellowship to develop a strategic plan for the agency's use of data collected by members of the public. This presentation that Jules is about to give will highlight ALLARM's regional data collection efforts, diverse projects across the nation, and explore how community collected data are leveraged to support environmental and human health issues protection. Please give a warm welcome for Jules Vastine.
Thanks, Max. And thank you everyone for being here. As Max highlighted, I'm a 2003 graduate. And it's super fun because we have the founder of the Environmental Sciences Studies Department, Dr. Candy Wilderman, online. We have Michael Hyman, who taught me about environmental policy that I used so much during my year at EPA. And also want to call out Alyssa Decker and Wande for being here from the department as well. So we have department members retired and here presently. So super fun. So thank you so much for having me here to talk about the ways in which we can leverage the power of communities and science in advancing environmental and human health protection and work, not only here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and our state, but also across the country and the world. So a little bit of where we are headed with today's presentation. We're going to do a little bit of a chat about what we mean by this term participatory science and talk a little bit about the field as a whole. Then I'm going to talk about the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. And then we'll start getting into some of the work I had an opportunity to contribute to at the Environmental Protection Agency and honing in on what are those tools for success for leveraging data collected by the public. And then we'll have time at the end and we'll save questions for folks online. We'll save questions for the very end. So please populate the chat with your questions. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. So if you are a watershed coordinator, can you please raise your hand? We have a number of, yep, look at that, great, thank you. So ALLARM is a community science center here at Dickinson. Our central mission as an organization is to build the capacity of communities to use water quality science, environmental science, to understand the health of their waterways and put those data to use for local change and decision making. We have a really dynamic team. We have a combination of full-time staff, part-time staff. I already gave a shout out to Candy Wilderman online. She is our founder and science advisor. We also have the full-time staff in the room. Can you all give a wave? Isabel, Phoebe, and Lindsay. We employ 10 to 14 Dickinson College students, and I always like to point out that we are 30% supported by the college, 70% supported by federal, state, and family foundation grants. I got to give a shout out to the Campbell Foundation. Thank you for joining today's talk for your support of ALLARM's work. And just because, can't, have a presentation that highlights ALLARM without highlighting the fact that we are hiring. CEAS will also be accepting applications around a similar time frame. We got Lindsay Alliance here. But if folks are interested in applying to ALLARM as a student watershed coordinator, we do have an open house coming up on March 20th. Okay, so let's get into it. What do we mean by participatory science? I sometimes like to refer to the field by the term C science, in part because you see a lot of C's and describing the field. So there's a lot of diverse terminology that has been used to describe the role of the public in collecting scientific data. So there's citizen science, community science. I'm going to highlight the ones that we use: community science, volunteer monitoring, and participatory science. In the past year, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency honed in on the term participatory science to describe these efforts. So it used to be these terms had very specific definitions that referred to specific kinds of relationships between professional scientists and members of the public, and or to describe the nature and way that science was carried out by volunteer and community scientists. But with the growth of the field in the past 50 years, we've seen all terms and definitions being thrown around, and and what we find now is that the terms in and of itself isn't the right way of describing the field, but more to get into the role that the public plays in the scientific process. So the field of community participatory science, members of the public or volunteer community scientists can play any part in the scientific process. In some situations, you have volunteer scientists suggesting questions for investigation. So how many of you in your classes have been able to contribute to a research project where the findings went back to a community partner? Yeah, we've got some hands up. I mean, the Environmental Studies Science Department is like super stellar at this. We have a lot of community partnerships. So there's a lot of that great relationship between folks being able to suggest ideas and areas of inquiry. And then sometimes, like we have here in our own department, you have folks carrying out the scientific research and then coming back to the community and using those data collaboratively. So in some ways, folks are informing the area of investigation. In the models that we use, we've used a diversity of models over the years, but currently we try to engage volunteer scientists in every step of the scientific process, from designing the question that data will help answer, to collecting the samples, to analyzing the samples, to interpreting the data and using the data. But there's lots of different ways that we can frame this work. And I should highlight that there's lots of ways in which volunteer scientists use data findings as a way of engaging this field. So, and we'll provide some examples on that later on. So this is a map that ALLARM has used a lot over the years. So those of you who are familiar with our work, you've probably seen this map, but it is the map that helps to describe our 38-year history. And it also helps to lay out the different ways in which ALLARM has engaged volunteer and community scientists. So we actually started as the Alliance for Acid Rain Monitoring. It's gotten better as a result of Clean Air Act measures over the years, but Pennsylvania still receives the most acidic rainfall of any state in the nation due to the coal-fired power plants to the west of us. And as a result, our founder, Dr. Candy Wilderman, was a part of a conversation with an elected official that was like, hey, people in Pennsylvania, one, aren't aware of this issue, and two, we need more data to document the effects of acid rain. So that started ALLARM's first community science project, working with volunteers to collect pH and alkalinity at sites all across the state. And ALLARM was the central user of those data. Candy was able to present those data to the state, and those data were used in the Pennsylvania Acid Deposition Control Act measures. But one of the things that happened as ALLARM was training volunteers on acid rain is that the volunteers started coming to us and saying, hey, we have some other questions we'd be curious about. Will pH and alkalinity answer my questions about agricultural runoff, or will it help me answer questions about this industrial polluter that's in my watershed? And so in 1996, ALLARM shifted its operational model from a top-down approach, which is referred to as the contributory model, to a co-created approach, in which we work from the bottom up. We walk in step with the community to help them design, implement, and carry out their monitoring programs. And that is a significant emphasis that they are not ALLARM's water quality monitoring programs, they are the communities. And so the areas marked in green here represent the sub-watersheds that where ALLARM has used this model, and it's the co-created model. We're co-creating, co-developing water quality monitoring programs. Another model that's represented here and is also true of a model that we're using today, the yellow represents our shale gas monitoring program. It's a pollution reporting program. We developed that protocol in collaboration with state and community partners. But once that protocol was in place, folks who are trained on it were following the same methodologies, and folks were using those data to determine pollution reporting instances. We also use a similar model with today's Susquehanna Stream team, where again, it's a protocol that was developed in collaboration with state and community partners. Everyone monitors the same parameters, but volunteers, including folks who are online today, hey, Don and Tina and Jeff, are carrying out their water quality monitoring programs and using the data locally. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So this is a map that describes ALLARM's operational models over the years. So let's pivot a little bit to the Environmental Protection Agency. So when you look at the field of participatory science across the nation, we had our first examples of data collection happening in the late 1800s, and that was folks collecting weather data. We still have lots of very robust weather data collection programs. But we started to see the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency engaging community collected data after the 1987 amendment passed to the Clean Water Act. With the Clean Water Act, each state is required to do what are referred to as these biennial reports, where you look at the status of the health of the streams, identify what streams are impaired, and this is published. We have these really great story maps that the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection puts out describing this. When the 1987 amendment passed, one of the things that was in that is it required the states, as they were developing their biennial reports, to assemble and review all available data. That included data collected in academia, that included data collected by members of the public. And at this point was when we saw the US EPA start to develop resources around the field of volunteer monitoring, which is largely referred to as the aquatic-based participatory science, because across the nation, you are seeing programs developing. To my record, there's only one state in the nation that does not have a formalized volunteer monitoring program. That's Nevada. I hope that I get proved wrong on that eventually. But all other states in the nation have some form of community collected data programs related to water quality. So we had really strong history of participatory science in the Office of Water at EPA. And then in 2014, that's when we started to see some other offices at EPA developing resources. And so in the Office of Air and Radiation, they developed an air sensor toolkit because we started to see lower cost sensors being developed that were looking at different air quality metrics. So you all can talk to one day about air quality another time. So they developed a resource for that. And then something super exciting happened in the Obama administration, and that was the passage of the 2015 Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act. And through this act, it requires all federal agencies to explore how to use and leverage data collected by members of the public. This is huge for us, right? Again, this acknowledgement of the incredible efforts of this country devoted to collecting data. In a Pew Research study in 2017, it was identified that 1 in 6 United States members of the public in the United States participated in a participatory science project. When you think about COVID testing and people doing COVID testing at home, that to me makes me think that there's probably a 1-to-1, if not a 1-to-2 ratio of people participating in informal science, participatory science. As people ask the question, am I sick? Is it COVID? Collect a sample, test your sample, interpret the results, and make an informed decision based on those results. That right there is a great example of participatory science. And so we're increasing the frequency at which members of the public are engaging in scientific research. So really the Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act provided a renewed impetus across the federal landscape to look at how to best leverage and use data collected by the public. And there's been some advisory councils that have helped make recommendations at APA. And something that's really exciting is through the Biden and Harris administration, we had 2 executive orders connected to environmental justice, which has resulted in 2 equity action plans. Just like to point out that this equity action plan was released yesterday, so I was excited to be able to put the screenshot of the report here. And in that, it has identified community-based participatory science as a strategy to achieving equity. Also at EPA, since the passage of this act, EPA is doing cross-agency coordination and developing different building blocks. They released their vision and principles document. They have a great interactive story map that highlights some of the grant-funded projects and EPA-run participatory science projects. We have this incredible handbook for quality assurance and quality control, which I'll talk about later on. And we also have a policy guidelines and checklist for EPA participatory science projects. If anyone wants to look underneath of the curtain at all the different policy and guidelines that are required by EPA to engage these types of projects, check out that policy checklist. So I was thrilled to be contacted by the EPA to work with them on exploring how to best leverage and use participatory science at the agency. And you know, the ability to come in for a year and fully focus in on this was awesome. It was also this incredible tutorial on the agency itself. I had no idea that there were 12 different program offices before I had this past year. There's also 10 regions. And so my first objective was getting to know the agency. And then at the same time, I had only had a year here to help develop these strategies. So I had to come up with a way to gather information and co-create a strategy with members of the staff at EPA. So I did things that some of you might have done in your classes. I conducted one-on-one informational interviews, getting to know the different program offices in the regions, checking the pulse of the values, the opportunities, barriers of participatory science at EPA. I then used that information to come up with areas of development that needed to happen, and I'll talk about those areas of development on the next slide, of areas where we needed to troubleshoot and co-develop strategies to confirm like how we best stand up for participatory science at the agency. I talked to practitioners at EPA that run participatory science projects. Probably one, hopefully some of you have heard of, is the HABS network, the Harmful Algal Bloom Watch. That's one of the programs that's run by the agency. Talk to them about their lessons learned and what works well and what doesn't. And then I developed topical focus groups, air, water, soil, land, and tried to get a cross section of all those program offices and regions to try to help develop strategies to overcome those barriers to data use at the agency. And then last but certainly not least, we held a workshop with state agencies and tribal nations, because already across the country, we have fantastic examples of state agencies and tribal nations doing this work and integrating these data into the work of carrying out environmental protection and human health. And it was important that any strategy that is developed at EPA is in alignment with the work that's already happening in the country. So lots of different products were developed, resources, guides, pagers. I really enjoyed being able to actually provide technical assistance to new participatory science projects that were being developed, as well as projects that were looking to expand. I loved work contributing to the Equity Action Plan. And I had a couple of personal goals while I was at EPA. One was to learn as much as possible about the agency, but I also wanted to showcase participatory science as an opportunity. Oftentimes when talking to regulators, there's an initial knee-jerk reaction around the use of data collected by the public. And it's not always a positive reaction. And one of the things that I found as I was talking to folks about this is it almost seemed like a burden. And yes, it is not easy, party people, to develop building blocks and to develop those pathways to facilitate something new. But at the outset, there's a lot of opportunity. And when you think about the millions of people collecting environmental data in this country, that is an opportunity. These are our allies. We're all allies with a similar goal here. So that was a goal for me. And I also wanted to make sure that I amplified the great work that was happening across the country to make sure that the agency was contributing to that. So there's 5 areas of focus that I see as like key pillars to help make participatory science successful. One is you have to have really clear and defined data use goals, and we'll talk about that. Data quality is absolutely important. You need to have tools for managing those data. You have to help people understand those data. Data collected sitting on shelves do nobody good. And then we have to talk about technical assistance. So the first thing I want to do, so as I'm walking through these tools, I'm going to highlight some ALLARM tools, state and regional tools, and then also resources at EPA. So one of the things that we do at ALLARM, anytime a community partner comes to us and says that they're interested in monitoring, or people are looking to expand their programs or change their programs, we're constantly bringing folks through what is referred to as the study design process. The study design process is where you're answering the who, what, where, whys of your monitoring program. And there's 2 very important questions that have to be answered at the outset. One, what is the question that is driving data collection? That has to be really, really clear. What is the question you hope to answer with the data you collect? And number 2, you have to answer the question of how you intend to use the data. Because depending on how you want to use the data, could be with your local municipality, it could be your county, could be the state, could be feds, that will directly tie to the quality of data and the metadata needed to help facilitate those use. But study design process is super fun. Charlotte was with me and Lindsay yesterday in Adams County talking to folks, helping them figure out their questions and identify how they want to use their data. It's always an exciting process to go through, and things that are similar as you're developing your own research studies in your classes. So when we think about data use, there's so many cool ways that data are being used across the country. And so I don't know if they're on, if we have Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arizona on, but I saw folks registering and I wanted to make sure I highlighted their programs. So Oklahoma has the Blue Thumb program. It's been around for decades. They're almost as old as ALLARM. And this is amazing collaboration between the Oklahoma Conservation Commission and the Oklahoma Water Boards, to the point that when data are being generated, seamlessly being shared and used across the 2 agencies. And so Oklahoma Blue Thumb works with volunteer scientists and their tribal nations in their jurisdiction to collect data and have those data to inform local protection measures, have those data inform state evaluation and augment state status, state data sets. Super cool and exciting stories coming out of Oklahoma and the Chickasaw Nation as well. Missouri Stream Team. Okay, so just have to say, ALLARM has a program called Susquehanna Stream Team. So far, I've been able to find at least 8 programs that have stream teams. So it kind of rhymes, you know. Anyway, but Missouri Stream Team is the first. And it's an incredible model of how to effectively engage your volunteer scientists. The way that they take care of, acknowledge, and celebrate their volunteers is great. They have really great data use at Missouri, and they have over 5,000 sites in their state that are monitored, and this is facilitated by their state agency. If Megan Smart is on, Megan can chime in later on. Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Yes, Arizona does have water that can be tested and data can be collected by participatory scientists, volunteer scientists. And this is another great example of how data are used to help screen for potential pollution, potential issues, and help augment data sets at the agency. Okay, so this is a pretty common data use spectrum that is emerging. You can see we have community engagement on one end and then all the way over here to enforcement. This morning I was on a call with the Chesapeake Bay program, and not sure if any of the CMC colleagues are on that. We were just talking about this, and we were talking about the ways in which we match different types of quality of data to different potential uses in the Chesapeake Bay. And it was interesting, like hearing the conversations go around of a lot of the data that are being collected and curated by the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which is one of our partnerships. You can see potential for data use across most of these spectrums. When it comes into regulatory enforcement, typically it's a screening tool, and then the regulatory agency makes those regulatory decisions. But it's so cool to brainstorm all these diverse ways that data that are collected by Don Horn, who's online, and Tina and Jeff Galine, and Tamala Trussell, if she's on. You know, you have so many great uses of your data. And one of the things that help facilitate use is thinking through some of our mottos. And we had a 2008 alumna, Danielle COC. This is Danielle doing a training in Thailand with ALLARM many, many moons ago. But we have a couple different data collection mottos. One is that all data of documented quality have use, and you must match the intended use of the quality of data collected. That's super, super important. That helps to manage expectations and make sure that we're aligning those quality of data with those intended use. And we can talk more about that later on. So here's an example. One of the partner groups that Isabel works with in New York is the Otsego County Conservation Association. We went through a study design process with them. They set their goals, established baseline understanding of their 6 watersheds in their county, and then they wanted to engage community members in monitoring and local education, identify sites for possible restoration and best management practices, and they wanted to use those data locally and support the Chesapeake Bay program's data needs. And so once they set their goals and outlined their question, we were then able to work with them to select their parameters and their methodology to make sure that it aligned with those goals. All right, so we're gonna move into data quality. This is a pretty dense guide, but it is an incredible resource as you think about how you build confidence within data sets. So has anyone here, and this might be more a question for faculty and lab folks, has anyone here ever had to go through the process of writing a quality assurance project plan? If you had, we'll get coffee later and hold space with each other. So there are these tools, quality assurance project plans, as you're collecting data to demonstrate how you build confidence within those data sets. So what are the actions? What are the decisions? What are the checks in place to ensure that the data that you are collecting are credible? And there's lots of different steps that you go through in developing these documents. ALLARM is happy to have several federally approved quality assurance project plans in which our work as volunteers and in our lab all are in compliance with those plans. So let's talk about ways that we can build confidence. So I am going to use an area example. This is the state of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. One of the things that can happen to build confidence between volunteer equipment and then the equipment used by regulatory entities is to do side-by-side monitoring of the two techniques. So the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, there are these things called purple air monitors that collect particulate matter 2.5 data. There's several in Carlisle. If you want to check a map later on, I can show you how to track those data. And one of the things that Oregon did is they compared that to their regulatory data collection on particulate matter 2.5. And then they're able to be like, okay, so we can create these things called correction equations. But they also were like, you know what, we might be able to develop a device that can do better. And they actually have developed their own sensor, play on the OR in Oregon, sensor to particulate matter 2.5. So that's a pretty common tool, is side-by-side monitoring to compare techniques, and that's used in water as well. The other thing that's helpful is writing quality assurance project plans are not accessible for community partners unless they've had experience with this in other ways. Like, these are really long, arduous documents. So ALLARM, we're a technical service provider, so we like to take on that burden and help write these plans to help streamline the processes for our community partners. So one of the things we did in the Chesapeake is we created 3 umbrella co-ops. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed, 64,000 square miles, has over 800 data collection entities that would fall under the umbrella of participatory science. And at the outset of our project, we surveyed the methodology to find the most common forms, and then developed an umbrella co-op that outlines all the different ways that you build credibility with those techniques and those parameters, so that anyone, as they're coming into the umbrella of the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, can be covered under our umbrella co-op. This only works with having technical support providers to help facilitate that experience. The other thing, and this is a tool that was developed by EPA, is using something called a template. So this is for their sanitary survey app, where literally they have documents that people can download, and you replace the highlighted areas with your own specific information. This is to help make these tools more accessible, but also making sure that people are asking those questions of how do you build confidence and credibility within your data program. The other thing I would say is not all equipment is created equal. That's a big thing that Lindsay works on in the ALLARM Community Aquatic Research Laboratory, is testing equipment. There's a lot of folks putting out there on the market more cost-effective tools to develop data, and not all of those tools develop credible data. And especially because we have a lot of community partners that want to use their data for change in their local county municipality. We want to make sure that they're collecting the best data possible with their price point. Lots of other things that we do, we make sure all of our techniques are in alignment with standard methods. That plays the holding times, it applies to acceptable precision ranges for the different techniques. It pertains to how you prep and clean your equipment. So our stream team volunteers and other volunteers, thank you for acid washing your glassware, so we're getting accurate nutrient values. All these things are really important. And then something that ALLARM does, we are the state quality assurance lab for any volunteer scientists in the state of Pennsylvania doing water quality monitoring. So thankful to our watershed coordinators, many of whom are in the room, that do help run the tests. And so we do what's referred to as a duplicate sample process. So as a volunteer goes out, they collect their sample for analysis, and they collect a second sample for analysis. They give us one sample to test using their equipment, and then more sophisticated equipment to determine whether or not they pass and they're using their equipment correctly. So huge tool that we're able to offer here. Here in Kaufman, it's great. Data management is a big lift. Just in case anyone was wondering, there's a direct way you can share data with EPA. If you found a potential pollution violation, there's a way you can report that through their report a violation tool. This is something I learned about this past year, and literally that same week, someone came to ALLARM needing to report a pollution event, and they had lab data. And so I was able to sit down with that person to help them upload the results into this, and that triggered screening by the agency. Anyway, sidebar there. So our volunteers will collect data, put them into data sheets. We're required to hold on to those data sheets for 7 years. And then they also input their data into a regional database. Having regional tools like this are fun and great. Across the nation, a lot of states have their own data management systems. So I really love the story of Georgia to South Carolina. Georgia adopted Stream, had been in existence. I think they've been around for almost 28 years. And South Carolina, when they were developing their volunteer monitoring program in 2018, they were like, hey, we're going to learn from our neighbors. And so they're able to reproduce and learn from their model. And one of which was to have these really accessible databases for folks to input their data. And in the case of South Carolina, they then share all data collected into the national repository, which is the Water Quality Exchange. You can download those data through the portal. So that's really important. Okay, so one of my favorite parts of the work that I did this past year was really focusing in on how data understanding is a really important tool with participatory science. So we are here located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We're in the top 10 worst air quality based on particulate matter 2.5, all because of the trucking industry and where we're located with our highway system. 1/3 of the United States population is within an 8-hour radius of Carlisle. So we're a shipping hub. So one of the things that's really important, especially for anyone in the room with asthma, you might want to check out Air Now to check your particulate matter 2.5 levels, and that will help give some guidance as to whether or not you should be masking when you're outside. We actually had some instances this fall where levels were so high that people should have been masking on campus outside. And especially with the increase in wildfires, in our continent, really important to be checking that. And we saw those plumes of smoke making their way to Carlisle this summer. There's some other tools at EPA too, where you can visualize and understand data. And literally this metric here tells you what the values are and gives you recommendations as to how to use those data. At ALLARM, data understanding is a really, really important value. And so it was really exciting. The Cumberland County Stream team just met on Tuesday, and we were talking about the fact that we'll be going through another data interpretation process in April. And Isabel was like, everyone started interpreting their data in the room. And we're like, wait, we're gonna have new data packets for you really shortly here. So it is really important that we teach folks how to understand the influencers of water quality, how to interpret their results. And because Don Horn, I saw that you were registered, and I'm so excited that you're on here. Here's a picture of Don Horn, giving us the rundown of his data findings on Big Spring. And Don has worked on local education projects. There's a great signage talking about water quality in Big Spring. So it's important to go through that process of organizing the data, graphing the data, using tools to understand the role of geology and land use and interpreting the results. Folks that are looking to apply, we've used R in this office. I'm going to look at Prerna, Charlotte, and a few others who have helped bring that tool into the office to help with this process. Our students that do GIS create incredible maps to help add those visual layers. And it's all in that process of helping people understand and discover those stories in their data. And once you understand the story in your data, then you can communicate it. And that's the sweet spot. We don't want data sitting in notebooks and on shelves or in database. We need to be communicating these stories and doing what Don Horn did with helping with community education. We have other examples of folks capturing pollution events. This is Cindy and the York Stream team saw something awry as she was monitoring, and then tracked it upstream to a pipe discharge, which was connected to someone who had a NIPD's permit to discharge into the creek, but they were in violation of their permit, which essentially resulted to a consent decree, which required that plant to clean up their act and fix the problem. So that's another example of understanding the data she knew based on her typical findings of what she saw in her creek on a regular basis, that something was off. Technical assistance is the sweet spot. When you think about having data used for diverse purposes, and anytime in participatory science, it's always fun to have partners. Like, none of the work that ALLARM does is on our own. There's not all of our projects are in partnership. And I'm just so incredibly thankful for that, because it allows, one, for the community to come together in diverse ways to support these efforts, but it also just makes it so much more fun. So technical assistance is important. So having centers like ALLARM, and what some of our colleagues do with helping to take the guesswork out of the scientific process. If you're, donating your precious free time, you want to maximize that. So let us take some of that burden off of your shoulders and test the equipment for you and help facilitate those conversations to help make your projects successful. We're really excited to be a part of a couple of great networks. The Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds, that's here in Pennsylvania. We are the oldest participatory science technical support entity cooperative in the country. And it's really cool. We have such diverse partners. You'll see USGS is on there. When we have technical questions, we ask our USGS colleagues on that. And we help each other out. Like Stroud has done macroinvertebrate trainings for us. It's super great. And it's a great network in which we can bounce ideas off of each other. We also have a similar cooperative for the Chesapeake Bay. So thankful to be a part of this crew as well. And that's servicing a larger geography. But the model here is similar. Learn from each other, leverage each other's strengths, and maximize what we can offer for volunteer and community scientists. And again, one of the things I just love about our work is that ability to walk in step with our community partners every step of the scientific process. I'm using some dated photos from a partnership, the Middle Spring Watershed Association, where we worked with them on visual assessment. We worked with them on their study design, identifying their questions, and then we taught them the different ways of doing monitoring, from visual assessment to chemical monitoring to benthics, worked with them on data use, and it's just an incredibly fantastic, fun opportunity. And it's just, so just gonna leave it at that. It's a lot of fun. So as I come into my last couple slides, I wanna leave you with getting back to that title. How do we leverage the power of communities in science for environmental and human health change? And I love this map, and actually we were just talking about these maps this morning in the Chesapeake Bay. The map on the left with those blue dots, that represents back in the late 2016, represented the sites that the Chesapeake Bay program uses in their assessment. And you'll notice there's some significant data gaps, especially when you get out of tidal water monitoring. And then we started to do these surveys to determine where volunteer and community collected data efforts are going on. And you see those pink purple dots, those represent where those efforts are taking place. And we've been able to add to that at this time. So when you even just look at the comparison of these two maps, we are increasing spatial and temporal data coverage with these incredible contributions of volunteer scientists. And when I think about, what we have the opportunity to do through our work at ALLARM, when we were in the meeting with the Watershed Alliance of Adams County yesterday, the volunteers were like, "Thank you so much for coming and being here." And our response to them was like, "We get to do this as a part of our paid job. Thank you so much for taking the time to donate your spare time to monitor your streams and put those data to use for local change." And when you look at what motivates volunteers to do this, I'm going to ask everyone in this room to think. I want you to think back, especially our environmental science studies colleagues here. I want you to think back to why you started. Why did you choose to take an environmental science studies class? Why did you choose to select this as your major? What were your goals? Did you want to make an impact in the environment? Does that resonate with anyone? Did anyone want to make an impact in your community? Did you want to contribute to the research that will help influence and make decisions around policies and changes in your community? If any one of those three touches on part of your motivation as to why you started, I'll just say those are the same documented motivations for folks participating in community science. And how beautiful and incredible is that? So whenever anyone thanks us for being in the room, I thank them, because what an incredible privilege it is to work with people who are willing to leverage their free time to protect their community and their environment. And with that, we'll open it up for Q&A. All right. Do we have any questions from the Zoom room? All right, well, first take a question from the room. But are there any questions in the Zoom room?
Not yet, but I just opened it up for
Oh,
additional questions.
okay, cool. Questions, thoughts, reactions? We might be able to start seeing questions.
I have one.
Yeah, Lindsay.
So some of the volunteer work that I've been involved, you've been at this a long time. I'm curious if you're seeing a shift, even in my own life, I'm having a hard time finding time to volunteer in the community, and typically the people that do are, older, white, potentially have the resources, you know, I think there's a class of that, and then there's like, or there's a direct, like something, this directly involves me, and I feel like even a lot of people where they're directly involved or it directly impacts them don't have the time to get involved. So my
Yeah.
question is, like, have the demographics of volunteers broadly, big, like, has it shifted to be more diverse in age, race? You
Yeah,
know, like,
I'm gonna whittle it down to
Yeah.
participatory science. First and foremost, as we know, environmental harm impactly affects communities of color. And you see significant environmental injustice with folks on the economic lines as well. So I think it's just really important to acknowledge that there's a disproportionate impact of environmental harm in our country. And to that end, one of the things that I talked about early on is the identification of participatory science as a tool to achieve equity in our field. This has always been a really strong pillar of working with affected communities. And you're right, you know, when folks are, you know, taxed by, you know, experiencing the personal effects of pollution while managing their day-to-day lives, like it's a really difficult situation in which to maintain and retain, you know, volunteers. I mentioned briefly ALLARM shale gas monitoring program. That was working with communities who are on the front lines experiencing the impacts of hydraulic fracturing. And we worked with a number of environmental justice communities based on the economic lines and definitions. And it was really hard to maintain volunteers in that program. We saw high levels of burnout, that feeling of I'm the one that's experiencing the impacts of this pollution, and now I have to be the one to document the impacts and ask for change. That's an extrinsic motivation, and that leads to burnout regularly. And so that is something I think that's really important to acknowledge. I will say in my 22 years, I will say that our volunteer base has become younger, which is really exciting. We have seen some connections of that to, you know, the economy in our country. Folks will look to volunteer science opportunities as a way of building skills, practicing skills, and keeping their resume current. We're seeing families being involved a lot more. That started with our fracking monitoring program, which made sense. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of work that can be done to make sure that we're always, you know, choosing the right time of day to have our trainings. That's something that we just identified in the past couple of years as we're only marketing to a certain type of demographic by having our trainings in the evenings and on weekends. It's like that doesn't help folks who are on, you know, second and third shift, you know, and things like that. So there's a number of practices that we're scrutinizing in our organization to look at that. And I also think that there's a powerful choice of allyship to also be like, to acknowledge injustice and leverage our own time to help collect data in areas where folks don't have the ability to be able to do that. So there are lots of different diverse thoughts there, but those are some thoughts. Yeah.
we did have a question come in the chat from Maggie Douglas.
Oh, hey, Maggie.
She asked, it seems like some water contaminants require really expensive and sophisticated methods to measure, like PFAS, pesticides. Do you see a role for community science in those issues? And if so, what does that look like?
Oh, yeah. So there's lots of different models, like I said, for doing participatory science. And a pretty common model, Maggie, I actually don't know where the camera is. A pretty common model, Maggie, if I'm looking at you, is for volunteers to collect samples and drop them off at certified labs. So we even have that, like when we have communities that are concerned with issues like heavy metals and pesticides and things like that, there are no cost-effective equipment out there that produce reliable, credible data. So hands down, when we're working with them on their study design, we talk about the importance of using certified labs to collect those data. So that is a pretty common approach. And actually, like I think about some of those studies of emerging contaminants that came out of like finding pharmaceuticals in our waterways. Penn State, through their water quality research lab, did a call out and asked people to collect samples from their streams across Pennsylvania to help increase the data coverage. Another example, Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection is not as jazzy as PFAS and pesticides, but even just to get a sense of bacteria issues in the state, used to run a program where volunteers were collecting samples on the recreational cycle, which is May through September weekly, to be able to assess bacteria. So that is a pretty common model in the field. And things like soil testing, there are no cost-effective equipment out there that are accessible for volunteers. And so one of the models for that is to have things called mobile science labs and soil shops where folks bring equipment to a location and residents will bring their samples from their backyards for analysis. So there's lots of great examples of lab volunteer partnerships. Okay, well, let's take 2 more questions if there are, and then we'll wrap it up. And there's still a lot of pizza, so for the folks in the room, sorry for the folks on Zoom.
Oh.
Yes.
My question is around kind of myth busting of participatory science. So what do you, in your 20+ years of experience in working with volunteers in this world, is kind of one of those biggest myths people come to you and say, well, I thought it was going to be this, or I thought I needed to have this, or what are those barriers that you help kind of break down and kind of a perception of participating in this?
I don't know if we have to work on busting myths with the volunteer and community scientists, because yeah, folks are opting in and ready to go and having a lot of fun with it. I do think we have to do a really good job of making really clear what the expectations around time is, because it takes time to be a part of these projects and things like that. But we always do meetings where we like talk about the program, let people answer questions so they can make that informed choice. I think most of my myth busting are with working with potential data users. I think that this is the only field, I'm gonna go on my little soapbox here, and I'm sorry, alarmies, you've heard it one too many times before. But this is the only field of science where we classify the science based on the audience collecting the data and not the discipline that is informing the technique. Our volunteers are aquatic scientists. Why don't we call them that? And so by calling it any other name in that list that I showed you, it's creating a natural bias. And working with some colleagues at the Office of Water, they're like, get the data into the national repository, because when people download the data, they don't have that opportunity to scrutinize the data collector. They solely look at the technique and the metadata. So that's something that I find myself grappling with, and I've had lots of different versions of myth busting with that over the years. So for me, that's always why I'm so excited to have those opportunities to cheerlead and amplify the great work that our volunteers who are on the line do in this field. One last question?
Yeah, we have one more question come in from Cheryl, who was curious on if you could talk a little bit more about how you were invited to work with the EPA in the first place.
Oh, how was I invited to? It was a cold Seriously though, it was March 1st of 2021, and I had this day where I was like feeling really lucky because I had just been called and told that I could get my COVID vaccine. It was just as the vaccines were rolling out, we were all like so desperate to get them. And I got this phone call from Sadler being like, "You made it, you're on the list," and I was like, "Woo!" And then literally the next phone call I got was from Jay Benferato, who recently retired as the Chief Innovation Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency. And he was like, "Hey," he knows me as Julie. And I was like, "Hey, Jay, by chance, would you be interested in helping EPA figure out how to do this work?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course. Why are you looking for me to volunteer my time? Like, what are we?" I was like, "So there's this thing called an Intergovernmental Personnel Act role that you could do." Anyway, so long story short, I was contacted for it, and just feel really blessed that folks in the room, as they were brainstorming the need to figure out these different pillars of how to stand up participatory science at the agency and ultimately help this country. What an incredible privilege that they thought of me, and yeah, just so thankful I got to have that year. All right, with that, thanks everyone.